Before I tell you the country and the year that we will be visiting in today's case, I first want to introduce you to the sponsor of today's video, TesterUp. If you haven't heard of TesterUp, it's a free online user testing platform that lets you earn PayPal money for trying new apps and games. With TesterUp, you'll get access to a wide selection of surveys, games, different apps, products and much more. As many of you know, I love my games, and the ones on TesterUp are great fun. I also love that it's super easy to use, and that you can do tasks, or play anywhere, and at any time. To receive real money, all you need to do is register, play games, solve tasks, and answer surveys. Of course, this is all free to do, and there are over 50 tasks available straight away. One great thing about TesterUp is that you can make your first payout to PayPal with as little as $70 within just 24 hours. If this sounds too good to be true, don't worry. TesterUp has excellent reviews on Trustpilot and has over 2.7 million members. If you want to discover new apps and games while earning money, make sure to download TesterUp, either by using the link in the description or by scanning my QR code. Now let's go to mid-19th century Wales. Mary Prout was born on the 12th of January 1843 in Amroth, a small village located in the county of Pembrokeshire in the southwestern part of Wales. It was an idyllic place, known for its picturesque landscapes, beautiful sandy beaches and coastal pathways. However, although Amroth was a beautiful place, life for the poor in the mid-19th century was difficult. The scenic landscape masked the harsh realities faced by many of its inhabitants. The fishing industry, a primary source of livelihood, was unpredictable and often perilous. Agricultural labourers toiled long hours for meagre wages, and the remote location limited access to markets and medicine. The women in particular faced a challenging existence, often confined to poorly paid domestic roles in the homes of wealthier families. Their days were filled with arduous tasks, such as cooking and cleaning and tending to the children, leaving little time for themselves. Despite the natural beauty surrounding them, many endured a life of hard work and constant struggle. Mary was one of 6 children and received very little schooling. In the 1840s, education was not compulsory in Wales and consisted mainly of charity schools, Sunday schools, and education provided by religious organisations, all of which usually only taught rudimentary instruction in reading, writing and arithmetic. Instead of going to school, when children were about 8 years old, they were sent to work in order to financially contribute to the household. Mary worked in domestic service and by all accounts grew into a polite and hard-working young woman. However, in 1863, she discovered that she was with child. In 1860s Wales, a pregnant young unmarried woman who worked in domestic service faced more than the perceived personal misfortune. Employers were bound by high standards of respectability and could not tolerate any lapse in moral conduct within their households. Pregnancy outside marriage was met with severe judgments, and the unfortunate woman was usually dismissed in order to preserve the household's reputation and adhere to the prevailing codes of propriety. When Mary's employer discovered that she was pregnant, she was told that she would no longer be required and that she would have to leave the house. While most unmarried women would turn to their families for support in such difficult times, Mary found herself unable to do so. Her mother had passed away 2 years earlier, and her father, having remarried, distanced himself from her. Neither he nor his new wife were willing to bring the shame of an unmarried pregnant daughter into their home. With nowhere else to turn, she was forced to seek refuge at the workhouse. She was just 21 years old, and now had to confront the grim realities of institutional life. The workhouse was known for its harsh conditions and strict regulations, but now would become her new unforgiving environment, as she faced the challenges of both her recent dismissal and impending motherhood. On the 9th of April 1864, just 2 months after arriving at the Narberth workhouse, Mary gave birth to a baby, who she named Rhoda, after one of her sisters who had died a few months earlier. Although life in the workhouse was far from easy, Mary adapted to her harsh circumstances with remarkable resilience. She was regarded as an obedient inmate and described as civil and orderly. She was grateful for the shelter and basic care that the workhouse provided for her and her baby. Yet her situation took a sudden turn in the middle of May, when the Board of Guardians discovered that she had a grandmother, a widowed lady named Mrs. Anne Prout, who could potentially provide her with a place to live, and they told Mary that she must leave. This was due to the institution's stringent regulations, which aimed to reduce costs by placing the responsibility of care on family members wherever possible. That often meant the removal of less vulnerable inmates to make room for those in greater need. Mary did not want to bring the shame of having a baby out of wedlock into her grandmother's home, but she knew that she would have to leave the workhouse. So on Friday the 20th of May, she set off on foot bound for Summerhill, a collection of a few houses, a short distance northwest of Amroth. She departed late in the afternoon, hoping to arrive at her grandmother's house by the evening. She was carrying her baby and would have to walk a distance of some 7 miles. It was not only the physical toll of the journey that troubled her, but also the anxiety about the reception she would receive when she was back in the village. Around 8 p.m, on the path leading from the high road towards Colby and Amroth Church, Mary encountered Mrs. Hannah Davis and her daughter. Mary recognised them both, and Mrs. Davis paused to admire the baby. After exchanging pleasantries, Mrs. Davis continued on her way, but her daughter lingered for a few moments to chat with Mary. They spoke briefly about the walk from Narberth, which gave Mary a little time to rest her legs. Before going to her grandmother's house, Mary stopped by the house of Susan Ebsworth, a relative who offered nursing services for children. Eventually, she knocked on her grandmother's door. Mrs. Anne Prout opened it and greeted her granddaughter. She noted that Mary looked pale, weak and very tired. Her clothes were dishevelled and her eyes reflected the strain of her arduous journey. However, Mary had arrived alone. Her baby was not with her. With a mix of worry and confusion, Mary's grandmother quickly ushered her inside and asked anxiously about the fate of her little daughter. On the verge of collapsing, Mary struggled to find the words to explain, her heart heavy and tears welling in her eyes. With great difficulty, she told her grandmother that the baby had died. When Mrs. Prout inquired about when this happened, Mary replied that the baby had passed away the previous Tuesday and that she had not seen her since. Mary also mentioned that the funeral would take place the following day. Mrs. Prout looked at her granddaughter, and despite her own shock and grief, she said, "Do not cry, Mary. Go down on your knees and give thanks to God for taking her." It was now late, so Mary and her grandmother went to bed. The next day Mary got up early, ate a little breakfast, and announced that she was going to see her sister, who lived in a neighbouring village. However, when walking through Amroth, people noticed that Mary had not got her baby with her. There had been much local gossip when Mary had found herself to be in the unfortunate position of being pregnant and unmarried, and despite pressure from her family, had refused to name the father. Now the absence of her baby raised even more questions. Mrs. Davis had already informed some villagers that she had seen Mary with her little daughter walking towards her grandmother's house on the previous day, and this only deepened the mystery surrounding the infant's whereabouts. On the evening of Sunday the 22nd of May, PC Peter Royal received information that the baby of Mary Prout had not been seen since Mrs. Hannah Davis had stumbled across Mary and her little daughter on the path leading from the high road towards Colby and Amroth Church on the previous Friday. The constable decided to investigate the area to see what he could find. Accompanied by 2 miners, named William Davies and John Davies, they searched around the fields and hedges, but found nothing. Knowing that there were several coal pits in the vicinity, they went to the nearest one, which was at Killanow, just a short distance from where Mrs. Davis had seen Mary 2 days previously. The 2 miners descended into the pits, and a few minutes later, William Davies emerged holding the lifeless body of a baby girl. Shocked and stunned, the 3 men paused, absorbing the weight of their discovery. They looked at each other, trying to come to terms with the seriousness of the situation. When they had regained their composure, they carried the body to the police station and informed the commanding officer. The next morning at 4 a.m, Thomas Kelly, the superintendent of Pembrokeshire, arrived at the home of Mrs. Anne Prout and charged her granddaughter, Miss Mary Prout, with murder. An inquest was opened on Tuesday the 24th of May at Saundersfoot, a village about 6 miles from Amroth. It was held in front of W.V. James Esquire. Witnesses included Mrs. Hannah Davis and her daughter, P.C. Royal, and William Davies, who had found the body. Pembrokeshire Superintendent Thomas Kelly told the inquest that when he arrested Miss Prout, she was very quiet and did not speak. But later she said, "I'll tell the truth if they hang me. I threw it in and ran away a short distance, then returned and found there was no noise." He added that the confession was quite voluntary. The physician who conducted the autopsy, Dr. Thomas Henry Newsom, told the inquest that in his opinion, the baby had died from a fractured skull. There was also a fracture on the left thigh and discoloration of the left knee, but he added that the child was well fed, her stomach was full of milk, and her intestines and lungs were healthy in appearance. He went on to say that he saw nothing to make him believe that the death had occurred naturally. The inquest found Mary Prout guilty of murder, and she was held in custody to await her trial. On Wednesday the 13th of July 1864, at the Summer Assizes in Haverfordwest, the county town of Pembrokeshire, Mary Prout pleaded not guilty to the charge of wilful murder of her daughter. She was represented by Mr. Thomas Allen. Although many of the witnesses were the same as those who had given testimony at the inquest, this time Mr. Allen was able to cross-examine them. When cross-examining Dr. Thomas Henry Newsom, Mr. Allen asked about the presence of red gum in the baby, a common Victorian term for a mild eruption on the baby's neck, often caused by poor quality milk. Dr. Newsom acknowledged that this condition could cause irritation and, if severe, might lead to convulsions. However, he emphasised that on examining the body, the red gum did not appear very severe. Mr. Allen then suggested that the baby might have indeed suffered convulsions and died in her mother's arms. Overcome by grief and panic, Mary could then have thrown the child into the pit. Mr. Allen asked Mr. Newsom if he had known the defendant for a while. The doctor confirmed that he had, and said that she had always been good-natured. Mr. Allen then asked the doctor if he had ever considered her to be of unsound mind. The doctor responded that he had not. Several witnesses testified to Mary's good character. Martha Williams, the workhouse matron, described her as very civil, and Esther Thomas, who had shown much kindness to Mary at the workhouse and had given her a cap for her little daughter as she thought that the baby was not thriving well, confirmed that Mary was attentive to her child and seemed generally fond of her. In fact, it was stated that when Mary was told that she must leave the workhouse, she requested a few hours from her duties so she could go to her grandmother's house and collect clothes for the baby. Her defence suggested that this action showed Mary's intention to care for her child and did not indicate a motive to harm her. Mary's grandmother, Mrs. Anne Prout, was called to the stand. She told the court how Mary had always cared for her baby, but also mentioned a family history of mental illness. She said that her own mother was considered peculiar and that her sister-in-law named Sarah Prout had once run away from the house in a state of undress. She added that when Sarah was escorted back, she was still not wearing any clothes. The grandmother went on to speak about her aunts Mary and Betsy, who both exhibited strange behaviours and often had to have their hands tied to prevent them from harming themselves. She added that Aunt Mary once climbed a ladder and refused to come down, and that eventually the poor woman was committed to a lunatic asylum where she lived until her death. When the defence made their closing statements, Mr. Allen addressed the jury for a considerable length of time and with notable skill. He presented 3 key points for their consideration. Firstly, did the child leave the workhouse alive? Secondly, did the child arrive at the pit's mouth alive? And thirdly, if they considered that the prisoner threw the child down the pit, and he did not deny that she did, was the prisoner in her right mind at that moment? He elaborated on these points extensively, aiming to highlight that Mary would be entitled to any benefit of doubt. The judge then summarised the evidence before the jury retired. After an hour's deliberation, they returned with a verdict of guilty with a recommendation for mercy, as they did not think that the crime was premeditated, and they believed that there was a history of insanity in Mary's family. However, despite the jury's recommendation for mercy, Miss Mary Prout was sentenced to be hanged. The sentence was appealed, and a petition was initiated by the local community, which rapidly generated the backing of over 1,000 people. This growing wave of support highlighted the widespread belief that Mary deserved leniency. The petition was presented to the High Sheriff, who was asked to request that the Home Secretary look on the case favourably. At the beginning of September, her sentence was commuted to 20 years transportation. But Mary was not transported. Instead, her sentence was later commuted to 20 years of incarceration. She did not serve the full term. In 1877, due to good behaviour, she received a conditional licence and was sent to a government-supported women's refuge. This arrangement allowed her to work and transition back into society. She was eventually released on the 23rd of May 1878, exactly 14 years since being arrested on the charge of killing her daughter. Mary returned to Pembrokeshire and later married Mr. James Rees, a gentleman 24 years her senior and now a widower, following the death of his wife 6 years earlier. There was some speculation that he might have been the father of Mary's illegitimate child. However, acknowledging such a relationship in 1864 would have severely tarnished his reputation, as society at the time held strict moral standards and judged harshly those involved in scandals or extramarital affairs. They went on to have 2 sons, who grew up and went to live in London. When Mary's husband James Rees died and Mary became a widow, she joined them. Mary Prout died in 1914 at the age of 71. After her death, her sons brought her body back to Amroth, where she was buried in the local churchyard, the same churchyard where her daughter Rhoda had been interred 50 years earlier. I would like to once again thank TesterUp for sponsoring this video. And if you would like to discover new apps and games while earning money, make sure to download TesterUp from the link in the description or by scanning my QR code. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case